Russia used to call Novorossiysk its untouchable fortress in the Black Sea. But a single night was all it took for that confidence to collapse. On November 14, 2025, a Ukrainian strike broke through defenses worth billions, destroyed S-400 systems, wiped out critical radars, and shut down the oil terminal that sustains a large share of Russia's exports. How did a country with a much smaller navy manage to flip the entire situation and hit the most heavily protected port in Russia? And what exactly happened that night to turn Novorossiysk into Putin's biggest strategic loss since the start of the war? The fall of Novorossiysk did not begin that night. It was only the peak of a process that had been eroding Russian confidence for months, because before the port was ever hit, the Black Sea itself had already stopped being a safe domain for Moscow. In practice, it had turned into something analysts began calling a dead zone for Russian ships. For decades, Russia treated the Black Sea as its strategic backyard, a space where its vessels could operate freely, protected by layers of air defense and by the proximity of Crimea. But that entire scenario collapsed. With the introduction of long-range naval drones, anti-ship missiles, and highly precise intelligence operations, Ukraine managed to turn the sea against the Russian fleet itself. Ships that once sailed without risk were now forced to operate in fear. Corvettes, frigates, and even logistical units were pushed into deeper waters or kept hidden inside ports. The sea that was supposed to guarantee mobility became a floating trap. Every movement was detected, tracked, and often attacked. Russia lost its freedom of action, and with that, it lost the core of its naval superiority. The impact was devastating. About one-third of the entire Black Sea fleet was destroyed, not by submarines or by large enemy ships, but by a combination of precision missiles and low-cost naval drones. Ukrainian explosive drones tore through Russia's defensive line, hitting frigates, landing ships, and even vessels at anchor. Neptune missiles reinforced the pressure, forcing Russia to scatter its few remaining ships across secondary bases. With the Russian fleet shattered and the Black Sea turned into hostile territory for Moscow, a new map of opportunities opened up for Ukraine. It was no longer just about winning at sea. It was about using the sea as a corridor to strike at the economic heart of Russia. With Russian ships pushed into distant zones or hiding inside ports, the Ukrainians began operating with far more freedom. Naval drones started crossing routes that had once been protected, and anti-ship missiles gained trajectories that would have been impossible if the Russian fleet was still actively patrolling. This created something unprecedented in the war: direct lines to strategic targets that had previously been out of reach, including logistics hubs, military docks, refineries, and most importantly, export ports. The Black Sea stopped being a barrier and became an open avenue that leads straight to the Kremlin's sources of money. And here is the critical point. Putin depends on those ports to keep his war machine funded. Terminals like the one in Sheskharis move millions of barrels, feeding international contracts and keeping a constant flow of resources to sustain ammunition, logistics, salaries, and equipment replacement. When Ukraine gains the ability to strike these terminals, it is not just destroying infrastructure. It is hitting the financial fuel of Russia's war effort. Every closed port means idle ships, suspended contracts, violated deadlines, and foreign clients looking for alternatives. From this point on, the battlefield stops being only military and becomes economic as well. And it was exactly at that moment that Novorossiysk moved to the center of the crosshairs. If the Black Sea was already open as a corridor for Ukraine, what happened in Novorossiysk was the moment that corridor turned into an extremely precise attack runway. Shortly after midnight, Russian sensors began registering something unusual coming from the south: multiple signatures, fast, low, and approaching. Within minutes, the pattern was clear. A devastating barrage of explosive drones was advancing toward the port, opening the way for what was coming next. By the time the first operators tried to react, it was already too late. The second wave was on its way. Neptune anti-ship missiles flying at extremely low trajectories to evade the few radars that were still operational. The objective was unmistakable: strike the Sheskharis oil terminal, operated by Transneft, the single most sensitive point in all of Russia's maritime oil logistics in the Black Sea. Aerial imagery from that night, now circulating publicly, shows the scale of the target. Giant storage tanks lined up like dominoes, networks of piping, loading piers, and pipeline lines all converging into the same vital center. It was a perfect target, and a risk Moscow believed was heavily protected. In less than 4 minutes, that illusion vanished. The first Neptune hit a critical section of the pumping infrastructure. The second struck the maritime loading zone, and when the finalizing drones hit the transfer valves, the entire terminal collapsed operationally. Fire spread through different sections of the facility, fed by the very oil that should have been exported. Thermal cameras recorded temperatures so high that automatic safety sensors began shutting down entire sectors of the network in an attempt to stop the spread. But there was no containment possible. Within minutes, the entire port suspended all activity. Not just loading operations, but also tanker arrivals, internal pumping, and pipeline flow. The logistics that moved millions of barrels simply stopped. And when a terminal of that size stops, the interruption echoes through thousands of kilometers of pipelines connected to it. None of this happened by chance. The attack was carried out by a rare combination of units that normally operate separately. The SBU, the HUR, naval drone units, special operations forces, and even border guard teams dedicated to maritime intelligence. Each one had a specific role, from mapping radars, tracking tanker routes, identifying Transneft's vulnerable points, and creating windows of electronic silence. The result was an operation that looked like it had come straight out of a modern warfare manual. Saturation attack, real-time intelligence, millimetric synchronization, and immediate exploitation of the collapse of Russian defenses. But while the terminal burned and the port shut down, the most humiliating blow was still to come. And it did not hit Russia's oil, but its military pride. For Russia, the S-400 is more than an air defense system. It is a symbol of power, propaganda, and the narrative that Moscow controls the skies wherever it wants. But that night, that symbol turned into scrap in minutes. Multiple S-400 launchers positioned to protect Novorossiysk were neutralized one after another, unable to react in time. And that exposes something specialists had long suspected. There were massive gaps in Russia's defenses around the port, weaknesses so deep that they allowed Ukrainian drones and missiles to approach without operators even realizing an attack was coming. On paper, the S-400 should be able to detect and intercept virtually any threat, from stealth fighters to cruise missiles. But in the real world, it relies on vulnerable radars, depends on integrated coverage, and struggles against swarms of small, low-flying targets. In Novorossiysk, that combination was fatal. The initial drone saturation, some real, others decoys, absorbed the operator's attention. Meanwhile, the Neptunes came in along routes where Russian sensors simply were not looking. By the time the Ukrainians launched the second wave, Russian air defense was already saturated, disorganized, and unable to distinguish what was a threat and what was a distraction. The result? Destroyed launchers, burned reload vehicles, and the entire defensive architecture dismantled. If losing the launchers was already serious, what happened to the S-400's radars was catastrophic. Ukraine targeted and hit the system's very eyes. Two critical radars were destroyed, 9-6 and 6. Cheeseboard, responsible for long-range detection and early warning, 9-2 and 6. Gravestone, responsible for target acquisition and missile guidance. Without them, the S-400 is not an air defense system, it is just a truck with tubes, destroying the 9. 6 and 6 wiped out the ability to scan the sea and coastline, allowing low-flying drones to cross the horizon without warning. And with the loss of the 9, 2 and 6, any attempt to intercept the second wave became impossible. The system was literally blind and deaf. This vulnerability is not new. The S-400 has always depended on high elevation angles to detect large, fast targets. But against drones flying just meters above the water with minimal thermal signature and unpredictable paths, it is exposed, and that night Ukraine proved it to the world. The attack did not just bring down the S-400, it shattered the image of invincibility Russia had been selling for over a decade, and with air defense collapsing, the path was completely open for the economic blow that would come next. When people talk about losses, it is easy to focus only on the burning oil terminal or the mangled metal remains of the S-400, but the real damage begins when those numbers hit the calculator. Each full S-400 battery, with its launchers, radars, reload vehicles, and command posts, costs around $500 million. In Novorossiysk, 4 of those units were degraded or destroyed, totaling roughly $2 billion evaporated in a single night. And that is only the beginning. The Sheskharis terminal was completely shut down for almost 2 days. That means between 1.5 and 4 million barrels of oil were not exported, depending on the active route at that moment. At average market prices, that range represents from $120 million to over $320 million in lost revenue, not including contractual penalties, logistical delays, or emergency rerouting of tankers. But perhaps the most serious damage is invisible: Russia's reputation as a reliable energy supplier. Oil markets hate uncertainty. When a port of that size is paralyzed by drones and missiles, international buyers begin questioning deadlines, contracts, and operational safety. And when a supplier loses predictability, clients look for alternatives. This is the kind of blow you cannot fix just by rebuilding pipelines. It is a strategic shock. Faced with an attack of this magnitude, Moscow tried to control the narrative. But the problem is that the confirmation of the destruction did not come from Ukraine. It came from Russia itself. The emergency headquarters of the Krasnodar region published notes admitting fires, operational interruptions, and significant damage to the port. Later, trying to minimize the impact, authorities claimed everything had been caused by drone debris falling onto the facility. But that explanation does not hold. Debris does not destroy long-range radars. Debris does not cut an entire port off from its pipeline network. Debris does not stop tankers or blow up critical infrastructure in multiple simultaneous points. Moscow's attempt to soften the story only made the episode even more embarrassing. Novorossiysk made one thing clear: naval warfare has entered a new era. It is no longer about who has the biggest ships or the largest fleet, but about who dominates intelligence, precision, and asymmetric technology. Ukraine showed that a country with a much smaller navy can completely redefine the balance of power, as long as it uses creativity, drones, intelligence, and timing. After that night, it became clear that the war in the Black Sea changed forever. Russia, which once treated the region as absolute territory, lost maritime control, saw its fleet pushed back into its ports, and ended up exposed to increasingly deep strikes. The coordinated attack on Novorossiysk was the peak of that turning point. Ukraine broke through Moscow's most expensive and most prideful defenses, struck the Sheskharis terminal, one of the pillars of Russia's energy economy, and turned 4 S-400 units, the system that was supposed to be the crown jewel of Russian air defense, into scrap. The impact was military, economic, and psychological. 2 days without exports, billions in losses, international clients questioning Russia's reliability, and the global exposure of the fact that, even with all its investment, Moscow's defenses still have serious vulnerabilities. And perhaps the most striking part is what this says about the future. Ukraine is redefining naval warfare, using intelligence, drones, missiles, and asymmetric operations that much larger countries cannot keep up with. Each strike shows a level of adaptation and creativity that is reshaping the balance of the war. When an entire port falls and even S-400 systems turn into scrap, one question hangs in the air. What happens when Russia tries to compensate for those losses with haste and improvisation? Because on another front, that is already happening, and in the worst way possible. Armored vehicles sent into combat without trained crews, without maintenance, and in some cases almost moving on their own. True zombie tanks rolling onto the battlefield. If you want to understand how this phenomenon emerged, and why it reveals something even more alarming about the state of the Russian army, click the video that is appearing on your screen. And do not forget to subscribe to the Military Ground. See you there.